The morning sun hadn't yet crested the mountains when Caleb Hartley rode out from his ranch, driving 30 head of cattle toward the distant town of Silver Creek. The dust rose behind the herd like a prayer drifting up to heaven, and Caleb pulled his bandana over his nose, squinting against the pale light. He was a man of few words and fewer expectations, and this trip was nothing more than business. Sell the cattle, buy supplies, and return to the solitude that had become his only companion these past 7 years. At 34, Caleb had grown comfortable with loneliness. It wrapped around him like a second skin, familiar and unchanging. His ranch sat nestled in a valley 3 hours' ride from the nearest neighbor, and that was exactly how he preferred it. People asked questions. People expected things. And Caleb had learned long ago that expectations only led to disappointment. There had been a time years ago when he had wanted more, when he had dreamed of a family, a wife, children running through the fields. But life had taught him harsh lessons. His parents had died when he was 20, leaving him the ranch and a pile of debt he had spent years paying off. And then there had been Sarah with her golden hair and her laughing eyes and her promises of forever. They had been engaged for 6 months, planning their wedding, talking about the future. And then she had met a businessman from San Francisco, a man with money and connections and a life far more exciting than anything Caleb could offer. She had left without saying goodbye, just a note on the kitchen table and a hole in his heart that had never quite healed. That was 7 years ago. Caleb had learned his lesson. He had closed himself off, built walls around his heart that he swore no one would ever breach again. He had his ranch, his dog, his solitude. It was enough. It had to be enough. He guided his horse alongside the herd, whistling softly to keep the cattle moving. His dog, a grey mutt named Ghost, darted between the animals with practiced efficiency. Together, they made a good team. The only team Caleb needed. By midday, the outskirts of Silver Creek came into view. The town had grown since his last visit 3 months ago. New buildings lined the main street, and the sound of hammering echoed from somewhere beyond the general store. Progress, they called it. Caleb called it noise. He drove the cattle to the stockyard on the edge of town, where old Samuel Morrison waited with his ledger and his squinting eyes. The transaction was quick and efficient, just the way Caleb liked it. Samuel counted out the payment in crisp bills, and Caleb tucked them into his vest pocket without counting. "Samuel, I'll be back for supplies in the morning," Caleb said, tipping his hat. "Need to find a room for the night." Morrison nodded toward the center of town. The widow Sullivan's been taking in boarders, clean rooms, decent food. Third house past the church, the one with the blue shutters. Caleb frowned. He preferred the anonymity of the saloon's back rooms, but Morrison's mention of decent food was tempting. He'd been living on his own, cooking for too long, and even he had to admit his skills were limited. "Much obliged," he said, and turned his horse toward the main street. The house was easy to find. Blue shutters, just as Morrison said, though the paint was peeling in places. A small garden struggled beside the front porch, and a hand-painted sign hung from the mailbox. Rooms available. Meals included. Caleb dismounted and tied his horse to the post. He removed his hat and ran a hand through his dark hair, suddenly aware of how long it had been since he'd cut it. Not that it mattered. He wasn't here to impress anyone. He climbed the porch steps and knocked. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then he heard footsteps, light and quick, and the door swung open. The woman who stood before him was small, barely reaching his shoulder. Her hair was the color of autumn leaves, pulled back in a practical braid that had begun to unravel. Her eyes were green, startlingly so, like new grass after spring rain. She wore a simple dress of faded calico, and her hands were dusted with flour. There was something about her that caught Caleb's attention, something beyond her obvious beauty. A strength in the set of her shoulders, a determination in her eyes that spoke of a woman who had seen hard times and refused to be broken by them. She was young, perhaps 25 or 26, but there was a weariness about her that made her seem older. Later, Caleb would wonder what had made him stop at her door instead of going to the saloon as he usually did. He would wonder if it was fate or chance, or simply the hunger in his stomach calling him toward the promise of a home-cooked meal. But in that moment, he knew only that something about this woman made him want to stay. "Can I help you?" she asked. Her voice was soft but steady, and Caleb found himself momentarily at a loss for words. He cleared his throat and remembered his manners. "Ma'am, I'm looking for a room for the night. Samuel Morrison said you might have one available." The woman studied him for a moment, her gaze traveling from his dust-covered boots to his weathered face. Whatever she saw there must have satisfied her, because she stepped back and gestured for him to enter. "I'm Clara Sullivan," she said. "I have one room available. $2 for the night, breakfast and supper included." Caleb followed her inside. The house was modest but clean, with worn furniture that spoke of careful maintenance rather than neglect. The smell of something baking drifted from the kitchen, and his stomach reminded him how long it had been since his last decent meal. "That's fair," he said, reaching for his pocket. Clara held up a hand. "Payment in the morning is fine, Mr. Hartley?" "Caleb Hartley." She nodded as if filing the information away for later use. "This way, Mr. Hartley." She led him up a narrow staircase to a small room at the end of the hall. The bed was made with a patchwork quilt, and lace curtains framed a window overlooking the street. It was a woman's room, soft and welcoming, and Caleb felt distinctly out of place. "Supper is at 6, Clara said from the doorway. "The washroom is at the end of the hall. Is there anything else you need?" "No, ma'am. This is fine." She hesitated for just a moment, and Caleb caught something in her expression. Worry, perhaps, or maybe just exhaustion. Before he could identify it, she was gone, her footsteps retreating down the stairs. Caleb sat on the edge of the bed and pulled off his boots. He could hear Clara moving around in the kitchen below, the clatter of pots and pans, the creak of floorboards. It had been a long time since he'd heard the sounds of a home. His own ranch was silent as a grave, which suited him fine. But there was something about this house, about the woman who lived in it, that made him feel the weight of his solitude in a way he hadn't felt in years. He lay back on the bed and closed his eyes. Just one night, he told himself. In the morning, he would buy his supplies and ride back to his valley, back to his silence, back to the life he had chosen. Just one night. The smell of roasting meat woke him. Caleb sat up, disoriented for a moment by the unfamiliar room. The light had changed, grown golden with the approaching evening, and he realized he had slept for hours. He couldn't remember the last time he had slept so deeply. He washed his face in the basin and made his way downstairs. The dining room was small, with a single table that could seat perhaps 6. 2 places had been set, and Clara was just emerging from the kitchen with a platter of roasted chicken. She stopped when she saw him, a flicker of surprise crossing her features. "You're awake." "I was about to come knock." "Sorry," Caleb said. "I didn't mean to sleep so long." Clara shook her head and set the platter on the table. "You look like you needed it. Please, sit." Caleb took the chair she indicated and watched as she brought out more dishes. Roasted vegetables, fresh bread, a pot of gravy. It was more food than he had seen in months, and certainly more than he would have expected from a simple boarding house. "This is quite a spread," he said. Clara sat across from him and smoothed her napkin in her lap. "I don't get many guests anymore. It's nice to have someone to cook for." There was something in her voice, a wistfulness that made Caleb look at her more closely. In the lamplight, he could see the shadows beneath her eyes, the slight tremor in her hands as she served herself. This was a woman carrying a heavy burden, though what that burden might be he couldn't guess. They ate in silence for a while, the only sounds the clink of silverware and the occasional crackle from the fire. The food was excellent, far better than anything Caleb had tasted in years, and he found himself cleaning his plate without meaning to. "You're a good cook," he said finally. Clara smiled, and the expression transformed her face. For just a moment she looked young and hopeful, like a woman who hadn't yet learned how harsh the world could be. "Thank you, Mr. Hartley. My mother taught me. She always said the way to survive in this world is to make yourself useful." Wise woman. She was. Clara's smile faded, and she looked down at her plate. She passed 2 years ago. My husband followed 6 months later. Caleb set down his fork, giving her his full attention. "That's a lot of loss in a short time." Clara nodded, her eyes distant. "Sometimes I think I'm still waiting to wake up from a bad dream. I keep expecting to hear Thomas's boots on the porch or my mother's voice calling me for supper, but they never come." She took a shaky breath. "The silence is the hardest part. I never knew how loud silence could be until I was alone in it." Caleb understood that better than she knew. He had spent 7 years learning the weight of silence, the way it could press down on you until you forgot what it felt like to breathe. "I'm sorry," Caleb said, and meant it. Clara shrugged, a gesture that seemed too practiced to be natural. "These things happen. The fever took them both. I'm just grateful I was spared." But she didn't look grateful. She looked tired, defeated, like a woman who had been fighting a battle she knew she couldn't win. Caleb wanted to say something, to offer some comfort, but the words wouldn't come. He had never been good with words, especially not the kind that mattered. So instead, he simply sat with her in the silence, letting his presence speak for him. After supper, Clara cleared the dishes while Caleb offered to help. She refused at first, but he insisted, and they worked side by side in the small kitchen. Their hands brushed once as they reached for the same dish, and Clara pulled back as if she'd been burned. "Sorry," she murmured, not meeting his eyes. Caleb said nothing. He dried the last of the plates and hung the towel on its hook, acutely aware of how close she stood. She smelled of lavender and bread, a combination that made him think of things he had long ago put aside. "There's coffee, if you'd like," Clara said. "I usually sit on the porch in the evenings." Caleb knew he should decline. He should go back to his room and keep to himself, the way he always did. But something about Clara Sullivan made him want to stay. "Coffee sounds good," he said. They sat on the porch as the stars came out, sipping from tin cups that had seen better days. The night was cool but not cold, and somewhere in the distance a coyote howled. "You're not from around here," Clara said. It wasn't a question. "No, ma'am. I have a ranch about 4 hours north. Came to sell some cattle." Clara nodded. "And you live out there alone?" Caleb took a long drink of his coffee. "I do. Doesn't it get lonely?" The question caught him off guard. People didn't usually ask him things like that. They asked about his cattle, his land, the weather, safe topics that required safe answers. But Clara was looking at him with those green eyes, and he found himself answering honestly. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but I've gotten used to it." Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I don't think we ever really get used to it. We just learn to pretend." Caleb looked at her. In the moonlight, she seemed almost ethereal, like something from a dream. He had the sudden, irrational urge to reach out and touch her, just to make sure she was real. "How long have you been running this boarding house?" he asked instead. "A year now. After Thomas died, I needed some way to support myself. The house was already paid for, and I had empty rooms." She shrugged. It seemed like the practical choice. "Has it been—" He hesitated, unsure how to phrase the question. "Has it been enough?" Clara's laugh was bitter. "Barely. The railroad was supposed to come through Silver Creek, but they changed the route last spring. Most folks moved on to follow the work. The ones who stayed don't have much need for a boarding house." "I'm sorry," Caleb said again, and once again felt the inadequacy of the words. Clara shook her head. "Don't be. I'll figure something out. I always do." But her voice lacked conviction, and Caleb saw the fear she was trying to hide. This woman was barely surviving, holding on by her fingernails to a life that was slipping away. He thought of his ranch, the empty rooms, the silence that pressed in from all sides. He thought of the meals he ate alone, the conversations he had only with his dog, the years stretching out before him like an endless road. And he thought of Clara Sullivan, with her autumn hair and her green eyes and her quiet strength. A woman who deserved better than what fate had given her. He didn't say anything more that night, but as he lay in the soft bed with its patchwork quilt, listening to the sounds of the house settling around him, he found himself thinking about things he had thought he had forgotten how to want. The next morning, Caleb woke early. He dressed quickly and made his way downstairs, expecting to find Clara already in the kitchen. Instead, he heard voices. Angry voices. He paused at the bottom of the stairs, listening. "I've given you 3 extensions already, Mrs. Sullivan." A man's voice, harsh and impatient. "The bank can't wait forever. Please, Mr. Foster." Clara's voice was tight with desperation. "Just 1 more month. I'm expecting more boarders soon. The stage route is changing, and the stage route has nothing to do with Silver Creek, and you know it." The man laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Face facts. You can't make the payments. The bank will take possession of this property at the end of the month." Caleb's hands curled into fists. He stepped into the hallway, making enough noise to announce his presence. The voices stopped. When he entered the parlor, he found Clara standing by the fireplace, her face pale and her eyes bright with unshed tears. Across from her stood a man in a fine suit, his expression somewhere between irritation and contempt. "I'm sorry," Clara said quickly. "Mr. Hartley, this is Horace Foster. He's the bank manager." Foster looked Caleb up and down, clearly unimpressed by what he saw. "A boarder, I presume." His tone made the word sound like an insult. Caleb said nothing. He simply stared at Foster with the flat, unblinking gaze that had backed down more than one man in his time. Foster shifted uncomfortably. "Yes, well, I was just leaving." He turned back to Clara. "End of the month, Mrs. Sullivan. I suggest you start packing." He brushed past Caleb on his way out, and Caleb had to resist the urge to grab him by the collar and throw him into the street. Instead, he watched him go, then turned to Clara. She was trembling. Her hands were clasped in front of her, knuckles white, and she seemed to be focusing all her energy on not falling apart. "I'm sorry you had to hear that," she whispered. Caleb crossed the room to stand before her. "How much do you owe?" Clara shook her head. "Mr. Hartley, this isn't your concern. How much?" She looked up at him, and he saw the moment her resistance crumbled. $200. "My husband borrowed against the house before he died. I've been trying to pay it back, but—" She swallowed hard. "I can't do it. I've tried everything. Taking in boarders, doing laundry, sewing, it's never enough. $200. Caleb had more than that in his vest pocket right now, the payment from yesterday's cattle sale. He could pay off her debt this minute and still have enough for his supplies, but what would that solve? She would still be here alone, struggling to survive in a dying town, and he would still be on his ranch, alone, pretending that solitude was the same as peace. An idea began to form in his mind. It was crazy, impractical, probably the most foolish thing he had ever considered. But as he looked at Clara Sullivan, with her green eyes and her quiet courage, he found himself speaking before he could think better of it. "Come with me," he said. Clara blinked. "What?" "Come back to my ranch. You can cook, clean, manage the household. I'll pay you a fair wage, and you'll have a roof over your head." Clara stared at him as if he had lost his mind. And perhaps he had. But the more he thought about it, the more sense it made. He needed help on the ranch. He had needed help for years, but he had been too stubborn to admit it, and Clara needed a way out of an impossible situation. "Mr. Hartley," she said slowly, "I don't know what to say. I can't just... I mean, we barely know each other." Caleb nodded. "I know, and I know this is unusual, but I'm offering you honest work and a safe place to live. No strings attached. If it doesn't work out, I'll bring you back to town myself." Clara was quiet for a long moment. He could see her mind working, weighing the risks against the alternatives. She was a practical woman. She had to see that his offer, strange as it was better than anything else available to her. Finally she spoke. "What about the house?" Caleb reached into his vest and pulled out the stack of bills. "Let me pay off the bank. You can sell the house and keep the money." Clara's eyes widened. "I can't let you do that. You can pay me back once you're settled. Consider it a loan." She shook her head, but he could see her resolve weakening. "Why would you do this? You don't even know me." Caleb considered the question. He could have given her a dozen practical answers. He needed help. He had the money. It was the right thing to do. But none of those were the real reason, and he suspected she knew it. "Because you deserve better than this," he said finally, "and because maybe I'm tired of being alone." The words hung in the air between them, more honest than anything he had said in years. Clara looked at him with something like wonder, as if she was seeing him for the first time. "All right," she whispered. "I'll come with you." They left Silver Creek 2 days later. Clara had sold the house to a family from back east, eager to try their luck in the frontier. She packed her belongings into a single trunk, which Caleb loaded onto the wagon he had bought to carry his supplies. The journey to the ranch took most of the day. They spoke little, but the silence between them was comfortable rather than awkward. Clara watched the landscape change as they climbed into the mountains, her eyes wide with wonder. "It's beautiful," she said, as they crested a ridge and the valley spread out before them. Caleb looked at the view he had seen 1,000 times and tried to see it through her eyes. The ranch sat in the center of the valley, a cluster of buildings surrounded by green pastures and dark forests. A stream wound through the property, catching the sunlight like scattered diamonds. "It's home," he said simply. When they reached the house, Caleb helped Clara down from the wagon. Ghost came bounding up to greet them, his tail wagging furiously. "This is Ghost," Caleb said. "He's friendly, don't worry." Clara knelt down and let the dog sniff her hand. Then she scratched behind his ears, and Ghost melted into her touch. "He likes you," Caleb observed. Clara smiled. Animals usually do. Caleb showed her around the house. It was larger than she had expected, with a big kitchen, a comfortable parlor, and 3 bedrooms upstairs. The furniture was plain but sturdy, and everything had the slightly dusty look of a home without a woman's touch. "I know it needs work," Caleb said. "I haven't had much time for housekeeping." Clara ran her finger along the mantel and examined the dust. "I can see that." There was a hint of humor in her voice, and Caleb felt something loosen in his chest. Maybe this wouldn't be as awkward as he had feared. "Your room is at the end of the hall," he said. "I'll sleep in the room next to it. If you need anything during the night—" He stopped, suddenly aware of how that sounded. Clara's cheeks had gone pink. "I'll be fine," she said quickly. "Thank you." The first few weeks were an adjustment for both of them. Clara threw herself into the work of making the house a home, cleaning every corner, reorganizing the kitchen, mending curtains and linens that had been neglected for years. Caleb watched her transformation with something like awe. Under her care, the house came alive in ways he hadn't known it could. But it wasn't just the house that came alive. Caleb found himself changing too, in small ways he barely noticed at first. He started shaving more regularly. He began to care about whether his shirts were clean. He caught himself whistling while he worked, a habit he had abandoned years ago. One afternoon, about 2 weeks after Clara's arrival, Caleb came in from the fields to find her standing on a chair, trying to hang new curtains in the parlor. The fabric was a cheerful yellow that he didn't recognize. "Where did those come from?" he asked, leaning against the doorframe. Clara glanced over her shoulder. "I made them. There was fabric in the trunk in the attic, and the old curtains were beyond saving." She turned back to her work, stretching to reach the curtain rod. "I hope you don't mind." Caleb watched her struggle for a moment, then crossed the room and reached over her head to hook the curtain in place. "Here, let me." Clara went still, suddenly very aware of how close he was standing. His chest was almost touching her back, and she could feel the warmth radiating from him. "Thank you," she murmured. Caleb stepped back quickly, putting distance between them. "They look nice." "The curtains." Clara climbed down from the chair, her cheeks flushed. "I thought the room could use some brightening up." "It could." Caleb cleared his throat. "This whole place could." They stood awkwardly for a moment, neither sure what to say. Then Clara laughed, a sound that seemed to break the tension. "We're being ridiculous," she said. "Living in the same house, dancing around each other like strangers." She met his eyes. "Can we try to be friends, at least?" Caleb felt something loosen in his chest. "I'd like that." "Good." Clara smiled. "Now wash up. Dinner will be ready in an hour." That night, they ate together for the first time as something other than employer and employee. Clara asked about the ranch, and Caleb found himself telling her stories he hadn't shared with anyone in years. The blizzard that had nearly wiped out his herd 5 winters ago, the summer he had fought off a mountain lion with nothing but a knife, the time Ghost had saved his life by warning him about a rattlesnake coiled in his path. Clara listened with rapt attention, asking questions, laughing at the funny parts, gasping at the dangerous ones. And Caleb discovered something he had forgotten, the simple pleasure of being heard. "Your turn," he said finally. "Tell me about Silver Creek." "About your life before." Clara's smile faded slightly. "There's not much to tell. I grew up in Boston, married Thomas when I was 19, moved west when he got a job with the railroad." She shrugged. "When the railroad changed its route, Thomas tried to start a business in town. It didn't work out. He borrowed money, too much money, and then he got sick." She looked down at her hands. "The rest you know." "I'm sorry," Caleb said. "Don't be." Clara met his eyes, and there was strength in her gaze. "I made my choices. I don't regret them. Thomas was a good man. He wasn't very practical. He dreamed big, but he didn't always think things through." "And you?" Caleb asked. "What do you dream about?" The question seemed to catch Clara off guard. She was quiet for a long moment. "I used to dream about having a family," she said finally. "Children, a home, a husband who loved me." She smiled sadly. "Thomas and I tried for years, but it never happened. And then he was gone, and I thought that dream was over. It doesn't have to be." The words were out before Caleb could stop them. Clara looked at him with surprise, and he felt his face grow hot. "I mean," he stumbled over his words. "You're still young. You could still have those things, with someone." She trailed off. Clara studied him for a long moment. Her expression was unreadable, but something flickered in her green eyes. "Maybe," she said softly. "Maybe I could." They finished their meal in silence, but it was a different kind of silence now. Charged, full of possibility. The days that followed were filled with work, but there were moments, small moments that added up to something larger. Clara's hand brushing against Caleb's as she passed him his coffee. Their eyes meeting across the dinner table and holding just a beat too long. The way Clara's face lit up when Caleb complimented her cooking. Caleb tried to maintain his distance. He reminded himself that Clara was here to work, nothing more, that she deserved better than a lonely rancher who had forgotten how to open his heart. But every day it got harder to remember why those things mattered. One morning, about 3 weeks after Clara's arrival, Caleb woke to the sound of singing. He followed it to the kitchen where he found Clara at the stove, swaying gently as she flipped pancakes. Her hair was down, cascading over her shoulders in waves of copper and gold, and she was singing an old hymn in a voice that made his heart ache. She stopped when she saw him, her cheeks flushing pink. "I'm sorry. I didn't know you were awake." "Don't stop," Caleb said. His voice came out rougher than he intended. "Please." Clara looked at him for a long moment. Then she smiled shyly and returned to her cooking, picking up the melody where she had left off. Caleb sat at the table and listened, watching her move through the kitchen with an ease that made it seem like she had always been there. And for the first time in 7 years, he felt something stir in his chest that he had thought was long dead. Hope. That afternoon, Caleb took Clara riding. She had mentioned wanting to see more of the property, and he found himself eager to show her. They rode for hours, up into the mountains where the air was thin and sweet, along ridges that offered views of the entire valley. "It's incredible," Clara breathed, reining in her horse at a particularly spectacular viewpoint. "I've never seen anything so beautiful." Caleb looked at her profile, silhouetted against the sky. "Neither have I," he said quietly. Clara turned to him, and for a moment something passed between them. Something unspoken, but undeniable. Then she looked away and the moment was gone. "We should head back," she said. "It'll be dark soon." They rode home in silence. But it was a comfortable silence, the kind shared by two people who understood each other without needing words. When they reached the ranch, Caleb helped Clara dismount, and his hands lingered at her waist just a moment longer than necessary. "Thank you," Clara said softly. "For today." Caleb nodded, not trusting his voice. He watched her walk into the house, and then he turned to tend to the horses, trying to ignore the way his heart was pounding in his chest. That night, he lay awake for hours, thinking about Clara Sullivan, about her green eyes and her copper hair, and the way she made him feel alive for the first time in years. He thought about the promise he had made her, the one about no strings attached, and he wondered if it was already too late to keep it. They fell into an easy routine. Caleb would rise early to tend to the cattle, and when he returned for breakfast, Clara would have a hot meal waiting. They ate together in the kitchen, talking about the work that needed to be done, the weather, the state of the herd, safe topics, comfortable topics. But as the days passed, Caleb found himself noticing things about Clara that had nothing to do with her cooking or cleaning. The way she hummed while she worked, the way her hair caught the light when she stood by the window, the way her green eyes crinkled at the corners when she smiled. He tried to push these thoughts aside. She was here to work, nothing more. He had promised her no strings attached, and he meant to keep that promise. But it was getting harder to remember why that promise had seemed so important. One evening, about a month after her arrival, Clara found him in the barn, tending to a mare that was about to foal. She had brought him supper in a covered basket, and she stood in the doorway watching him work. "Is she going to be all right?" Clara asked. Caleb nodded, his hands gentle on the mare's swollen belly. "Should be. First foal, so she's nervous. But she's strong." Clara came closer, setting the basket aside. "Can I help? Just keep her calm. Talk to her. Let her know she's not alone." Clara knelt beside the mare's head and began to speak softly, her voice low and soothing. Caleb couldn't make out the words, but he saw the mare's ears perk up, her breathing slow. They stayed that way for hours, working together in the dim light of the lantern. When the foal finally came, wet and wobbling and perfect, Clara laughed with pure joy. "Oh," she breathed. "Oh, he's beautiful." Caleb corrected. "It's a filly." Clara reached out to touch the foal's soft nose, and the little creature nuzzled against her palm. In that moment, with her hair falling loose around her face and her eyes shining with wonder, Clara was the most beautiful thing Caleb had ever seen. He looked away quickly, afraid she might read his thoughts. "Thank you," he said gruffly, "for your help." Clara smiled at him, and his heart did something strange in his chest. any time. After that night, things changed between them. The distance Caleb had carefully maintained began to crumble. He found excuses to seek her out during the day, to ask her opinion on trivial matters, to linger at the table after meals. Clara seemed to sense the shift, though she never mentioned it directly. But Caleb noticed that she too found reasons to be near him. She would bring him coffee while he worked in the barn. She would ask him to taste whatever she was cooking, standing close enough that he could smell the lavender in her hair. The tension built slowly, like a storm gathering on the horizon. They both felt it, but neither spoke of it. Perhaps they were both afraid of what would happen if they did. Then came the night of the thunderstorm. Caleb was in the barn, checking on the horses, when the sky split open. Lightning tore through the darkness, followed by thunder so loud it shook the walls. The horses screamed, and Caleb spent the next hour trying to calm them. By the time the worst of the storm had passed, he was soaked to the bone. He trudged back to the house, expecting to find Clara in bed. Instead, he found her in the kitchen, wrapped in a shawl, with a pot of coffee on the stove. She stopped when she saw him, a flicker of surprise crossing her features. "You're awake. I was about to come knock." "Sorry," Caleb said. "I didn't mean to sleep so long." Clara shook her head and set the platter on the table. "You looked like you needed it. Please sit." "I couldn't sleep," she said. "The thunder." She trailed off, and Caleb saw the fear in her eyes. She was trembling, though whether from cold or terror, he couldn't tell. Without thinking, he crossed the room and took her hands in his. They were ice cold. "You're freezing," he said. Clara looked up at him, and something passed between them, something unspoken but undeniable. "So are you," she whispered. Caleb knew he should step back. He should let go of her hands and retreat to his room and pretend this moment had never happened. But her eyes were so green, and her lips were slightly parted, and he was so tired of being alone. He kissed her. It was gentle at first, tentative, as if he was asking permission. Clara made a small sound in her throat, and then her arms were around his neck, pulling him closer. The kiss deepened, and Caleb forgot about the cold, forgot about the storm, forgot about everything except the woman in his arms. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathing hard. "I'm sorry," Caleb said. "I shouldn't have—" "Don't." Clara placed a finger on his lips. "Don't apologize. I've been wanting you to do that for weeks." Caleb stared at her. "You have." Clara's laugh was shaky. "You really are oblivious, aren't you?" He kissed her again, and this time there was nothing tentative about it. He kissed her like a man who had been dying of thirst and had finally found water. She responded with equal fervor, her fingers tangling in his wet hair, her body pressing against his. When they finally pulled apart, Caleb rested his forehead against hers. "I don't know what I'm doing," he admitted. "I haven't felt this way in— I don't think I've ever felt this way." Clara's hand came up to cup his cheek. "Neither have I." They stood that way for a long moment, wrapped in each other's arms, while the storm raged outside. And for the first time in 7 years, Caleb didn't feel alone. The weeks that followed were the happiest of Caleb's life. He and Clara didn't rush things. They took their time, learning each other, building something real and lasting. But the change in their relationship was obvious. They ate their meals together, talking and laughing like old friends. They worked side by side on the ranch, and in the evenings they sat on the porch and watched the sunset. And every night before they retired to their separate rooms, Caleb would kiss Clara goodnight, just one kiss, soft and sweet, that left them both wanting more. "I respect you too much to rush this," he told her one night. When we take that step, I want it to be right." Clara had smiled and traced her finger along his jaw. "I know. That's one of the reasons I love you." She had said it so casually, as if it was the most obvious thing in the world. And maybe it was, because Caleb loved her too. He had loved her, he realized, from the moment she had opened her door in Silver Creek and looked at him with those impossible green eyes. But before he could find the words to tell her, everything changed. It started with a letter. Clara was in town picking up supplies when the postmaster flagged her down. "Letter for you, Mrs. Sullivan, came all the way from Boston." Clara took the envelope with trembling hands. She recognized the handwriting immediately. It was from her sister, Margaret, the only family she had left. She read the letter 3 times before the words sank in. Margaret was dying. The doctors gave her weeks, maybe less. She wanted to see Clara one last time. Clara didn't remember the ride back to the ranch. She didn't remember hitching the wagon or walking into the house. She only remembered finding Caleb in the kitchen, his face going pale as he read the letter she thrust into his hands. "I have to go," she said. "She's my sister. She's all I have left." Caleb nodded slowly. "Of course. I'll take you to town tomorrow. We can catch the stage to the railway." Clara shook her head. "You don't have to come with me. The ranch can wait," Caleb interrupted. He crossed the room and took her hands in his. "I'm not letting you do this alone." Clara's eyes filled with tears. "Why? Because I love you." The words hung in the air between them. Clara stared at him, her lips parting in surprise. Caleb hadn't meant to say it like this. He had been waiting for the right moment, the perfect moment. But seeing her standing there, terrified and heartbroken, he couldn't hold it back any longer. "I love you," he said again. "I think I've loved you from the beginning. And I know this isn't the right time, but I needed you to know, whatever happens, I'm with you." Clara launched herself into his arms, burying her face against his chest. Caleb held her as she cried, stroking her hair, murmuring words of comfort. When her tears finally subsided, she looked up at him with red-rimmed eyes. "I love you too," she whispered. "I was so afraid you didn't feel the same." Caleb laughed, a sound rusty with disuse. "I think I've been the last to know." They left at dawn the next morning. Caleb had arranged for a neighbor to look after the ranch, promising to return as soon as he could. He helped Clara into the wagon and climbed up beside her, taking the reins. The journey to Boston took 3 weeks. 3 weeks of trains and stagecoaches and crowded hotels. 3 weeks of Clara growing more anxious with every passing day. But through it all, Caleb was by her side. He held her hand during the long hours on the train. He sat with her in the dining car, making sure she ate even when she had no appetite. He lay beside her in their shared hotel rooms, keeping a respectful distance, but close enough that she could feel his warmth. On the train, Clara told him stories about her childhood, about growing up in Boston with Margaret, about their father who had worked in a print shop, about their mother who had taught them both to cook and sew and make a home out of nothing. She told him about the day she met Thomas at a church social, about how he had made her laugh and promised her adventures. "I loved him," Clara said one night, as the train rocked gently through the darkness. "Not the way I love you, but I did love him. He was kind to me. He tried his best." Caleb pulled her closer. "You don't have to explain. I know, but I want you to understand." She looked up at him, her green eyes luminous in the lamplight. "Thomas was my past. You're my future. I need you to know that." Caleb kissed her forehead. "I know." In turn, Caleb told her about Sarah, about how he had believed she loved him, about the morning he had found her note and felt his heart shatter into 1,000 pieces. He told her about the years he had spent building walls, convinced that love was just another word for pain. "But then I met you," he said, "and you broke down every wall I had built. You made me want to feel again, even though it terrified me." Clara touched his face. "I'm not going anywhere, Caleb. I know that now." He caught her hand and kissed her palm. "I trust you. I trust us." They arrived in Boston on a Tuesday afternoon. The city was unlike anything Caleb had ever seen, all noise and crowds and buildings that reached toward the sky. He felt out of place in his dusty boots and worn hat, but Clara clung to his arm as if he was the only solid thing in a world that was spinning out of control. Margaret's house was a modest brownstone in a quiet neighborhood. A nurse answered the door, her face grave. "You must be Clara," she said. "I'm afraid your sister is very weak, but she's been asking for you." Clara's hand tightened on Caleb's arm. "He's coming with me." The nurse hesitated, then nodded. "Very well, but please keep it brief." They found Margaret in a back bedroom, propped up on pillows. She was small and pale, a shadow of the vibrant woman Clara remembered. But her eyes lit up when she saw her sister. "Clara," she breathed, "you came. Of course I came." Clara rushed to her sister's side, taking her frail hand. "Oh, Maggie, I'm so sorry it took me so long. Don't be sorry." Margaret's gaze drifted to Caleb, who stood awkwardly in the doorway. "And who is this?" Clara looked back at him, her eyes shining. "This is Caleb. He's—" She faltered, unsure what to call him. "I'm hers," Caleb said simply. Margaret smiled, a weak but genuine expression. "Good. She deserves someone to look after her." She turned back to Clara. "I always worried about you, out there alone, but I can see you're in good hands." The next few days were a blur. Clara spent every moment she could at her sister's bedside, talking, laughing, crying. She told Margaret about the ranch, about the mountains, about the life she was building. She told her about Caleb, about the man who had found her when she was at her lowest and lifted her up. Caleb stayed in the background, giving the sisters their space. But when Clara needed him, he was there. A hand on her shoulder, a cup of tea, a quiet presence that reminded her she wasn't alone. Margaret passed away on a Sunday morning, with Clara holding her hand. "It was peaceful," the nurse said, "as peaceful as these things can be." Clara was devastated. Caleb held her as she wept, as she raged against a world that kept taking the people she loved. He didn't try to fix her pain. He just let her feel it and promised her that she would get through this. They stayed in Boston for the funeral. It was a small affair, just a handful of Margaret's friends and the minister. Clara stood by the grave in her black dress, her face like stone. But when they lowered the coffin into the ground, she reached for Caleb's hand. "Take me home," she whispered. Caleb brought her hand to his lips. "Always." The journey back to the ranch was slower. Clara was quiet, lost in her grief, and Caleb didn't push her to talk. He simply stayed close, a constant presence at her side. But as the miles passed and the mountains grew on the horizon, something began to shift. Clara started to eat again, to sleep without nightmares. She started to smile, small smiles at first, but smiles nonetheless. On their last night before reaching the ranch, they stopped at a small inn in a town whose name Caleb couldn't remember. They shared a room, as they had for the entire journey, with Caleb sleeping on the floor and Clara in the bed. But that night, as Caleb was arranging his blankets, Clara's voice stopped him. "Don't." He looked up. "Don't what?" "Don't sleep on the floor." Clara sat up, her eyes meeting his. "I don't want to be alone tonight. I want you beside me." Caleb hesitated. "Clara, I don't want to. I'm not asking you to." She shook her head. "I just want to feel you next to me. I need to know you're real." Caleb crossed to the bed and sat on the edge. "Clara, are you sure?" She nodded, her eyes never leaving his. "I've never been more sure of anything." Caleb kicked off his boots and lay down beside her. Clara immediately curled into his side, her head on his chest, her arm draped across his waist. She fit against him perfectly, as if she had been made for exactly this spot. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." Caleb pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "You don't have to thank me." "Yes, I do." Clara lifted her head to look at him. "You saved me, Caleb. Not just from the bank or from Silver Creek. You saved me from myself." Caleb shook his head. "You saved yourself. I just gave you a place to land." Clara smiled, and for the first time since Boston, it reached her eyes. "Either way, I'm grateful." She kissed him then, soft and slow. Caleb responded in kind, his hand coming up to cup her face. The kiss deepened, grew warmer, but Clara pulled back before it could go further. "When we're home," she said, "I want our first time to be in our bed, in our house." Caleb smiled. "Our house?" Clara's cheeks flushed. "If you want it to be." He pulled her closer, wrapping his arms around her. "There's nothing I want more." They arrived at the ranch the next afternoon. The neighbor had taken good care of things, and Ghost nearly knocked Clara over in his excitement. She laughed and knelt to hug the dog, and Caleb felt his heart swell at the sight. "Home," he said. "Welcome home." Clara looked up at him, her green eyes bright with tears. "Say it again. Home." Caleb knelt beside her, taking her hand. "This is your home now, Clara. Our home, if you'll have it." Clara threw her arms around him, sending them both tumbling into the grass. Ghost barked and danced around them, and Clara was laughing and crying at the same time. "Yes," she said. "Yes, yes, 1,000 times, yes." Caleb kissed her right there in the yard, with the mountains watching and the sun warming their faces. He kissed her until they were both breathless, until the world narrowed down to just the two of them. Then he stood and helped her to her feet. "Let's go inside." They barely made it through the door. Clara was in his arms the moment it closed behind them, her lips on his, her fingers working the buttons of his shirt. Caleb lifted her, carrying her up the stairs to his bedroom, their bedroom. He laid her on the bed, taking a moment to just look at her. Her hair had come loose from its braid, spreading across the pillow like autumn leaves. Her green eyes were dark with want, her chest rising and falling with rapid breaths. "You're beautiful," he said. Clara reached for him. "Show me." Caleb took his time. He cherished every moment with her, showing her with tenderness and care what she meant to him. He worshipped her with gentle touches and whispered words, letting her know with his body what he couldn't always express aloud. And when they finally came together, it was like coming home, like finding a piece of himself he hadn't known was missing. Clara whispered his name, and Caleb buried his face in her neck, holding her close. Afterward, they lay tangled together, too content to move. Clara traced lazy patterns on his chest, and Caleb ran his fingers through her hair. "I want to marry you," he said. Clara propped herself up on her elbow. "What?" "Marry me." Caleb sat up, suddenly nervous. "I know it's fast. I know we haven't known each other very long, but I love you, Clara. I want to spend the rest of my life with you. I want to wake up next to you every morning and fall asleep beside you every night. I want—" "Yes." He blinked. "Yes?" Clara was laughing, tears streaming down her face. "Yes, Caleb Hartley, I will marry you." She kissed him, and he kissed her back, and for a long while no more words were necessary. They were married a month later, in a small ceremony at the ranch. The neighbor came, and a few folks from town, and the minister who had traveled half a day to perform the service. Clara wore a dress of pale blue that brought out her eyes, and Caleb wore his best suit, the one he hadn't touched in 7 years. The morning of the wedding, Clara stood before the mirror in her room, trying to calm her nerves. She had been married before, but this felt different. This felt like the beginning of something real, something lasting. This felt like coming home. A knock at the door made her turn. Caleb stood in the hallway, looking handsome and nervous in his dark suit. "You're not supposed to see me before the ceremony," Clara said, but she was smiling. "I couldn't wait." Caleb crossed the threshold and took her hands. "I needed to see you, to make sure this was real. It's real." Clara squeezed his hands. "I'm real. And in about an hour I'm going to be your wife." Caleb's smile lit up his face. "My wife." I like the sound of that. Ghost served as ring bearer, trotting down the makeshift aisle with a ribbon tied to his collar. Clara laughed when she saw him, and Caleb felt his heart overflow. The minister spoke words about love and commitment, but Caleb barely heard them. He was too busy looking at Clara, this incredible woman who had walked into his life and changed everything. When it came time for the vows, Clara went first. "Caleb Hartley," she said, her voice steady despite the tears on her cheeks. "I came to you with nothing. No money, no home, no hope. You gave me all of those things and more. You gave me a reason to believe in second chances. You showed me that love isn't just a word in a storybook. It's action, it's sacrifice, it's showing up day after day and choosing the other person. I choose you, Caleb, today and every day, for as long as I live." Caleb swallowed hard, his own eyes burning. "Clara Sullivan, I spent 7 years convincing myself I didn't need anyone, that I was better off alone. Then you showed up at your door in Silver Creek, and everything I thought I knew went out the window. You're the strongest person I've ever met, the kindest, the most beautiful. I don't deserve you, but I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy. I love you. I will always love you." The minister pronounced them husband and wife, and Caleb kissed his bride while their small audience cheered. Ghost barked his approval, and somewhere in the distance a hawk cried out over the mountains. That night they sat on the porch, watching the stars come out. Clara was nestled against Caleb's side, her head on his shoulder, his arm wrapped around her. "Mrs. Hartley," he said, testing the words. "I like the sound of that." Clara smiled. "So do I." They sat in comfortable silence for a while. Then Clara spoke again. "Do you remember what you said to me that first night in Silver Creek, when I asked if you ever got lonely?" Caleb thought back. "I said I had gotten used to it." Clara nodded. "And I said we never really get used to it. We just learn to pretend." "I remember." Clara turned to look at him, her green eyes shining in the moonlight. "I'm glad I don't have to pretend anymore." Caleb kissed her, soft and sweet. "Neither do I." A year later, Clara stood in the doorway of the barn, watching Caleb work with the new foal. It was the daughter of the mare they had helped birth together, the night everything changed. He was patient and gentle, murmuring to the young horse, earning her trust step by step. Some things never change, she thought, and some things change in ways you never expected. She placed her hand on her stomach, feeling the flutter of new life within her. She hadn't told Caleb yet. She was waiting for the right moment. "Clara," his voice pulled her from her thoughts. "Come see this." She walked over, and Caleb helped her into the paddock. The foal, curious and brave, approached her and nuzzled against her palm. "She likes you," Caleb said. Clara smiled. "She has good taste." Caleb laughed and pulled her into his arms. The foal whickered and pranced away, giving them their moment. "I have something to tell you," Clara said. Caleb raised an eyebrow. "Sounds serious." "It is." Clara took his hand and placed it on her stomach. "We're going to have a baby." For a moment, Caleb just stared at her. Then his face transformed, breaking into the widest smile she had ever seen. "A baby? A baby." Clara was laughing and crying at the same time. "Come spring!" Caleb let out a whoop that startled the horses and lifted Clara off her feet, spinning her around. "A baby! We're having a baby! Put me down, you fool!" Clara was laughing so hard she could barely speak. "I'm going to be sick." Caleb set her down gently, his hands cradling her face. "A baby," he repeated, wonder in his voice. "Clara, I don't have words." Clara kissed him. "Then don't talk." He didn't. The baby came in April, on a morning bright with spring sunshine. It was a boy with his father's dark hair and his mother's green eyes. They named him Thomas, after Clara's late husband, because Clara believed in honoring the past while embracing the future. "He's perfect," Caleb whispered, holding his son for the first time. "How is he so small?" Clara laughed from the bed. He'll grow. Give him time. Caleb sat beside her, the baby cradled in his arms. "Thank you," he said. "For what?" "For this. All of it." Caleb looked at her, his eyes bright. "A year ago, I was alone. I thought that was what I wanted. I thought I didn't need anyone. Then you came along and—" He shook his head, overcome with emotion. "You changed everything." Clara reached up to touch his face. "We changed each other." Caleb leaned down to kiss her, careful not to disturb the sleeping baby. "I love you," he murmured against her lips. "I love you too." Outside, the mountain stood tall against the blue sky, and the stream sparkled in the sunlight. Ghost lay on the porch, his tail thumping against the boards. And in the little house in the valley, a family began. Years passed. Thomas grew into a strong, curious boy who loved the horses and the mountains and the stories his mother told about a town called Silver Creek. 2 more children followed, a girl named Margaret after Clara's sister, and another boy named after Caleb's father. The house that had once been silent now rang with laughter and arguments and all the beautiful chaos of family life. Each child brought new joys and new challenges. Thomas was serious and thoughtful like his father, always asking questions about the land and the cattle and the way things worked. Margaret was spirited and adventurous, constantly getting into trouble and then charming her way out of it. And young William was the dreamer, spending hours by the stream with a sketchbook, capturing the beauty of the valley on paper. Clara watched her children grow with wonder and gratitude. She remembered the days when she had thought she would never be a mother, when she had resigned herself to a life alone. Now, she had more than she had ever dared to hope for. One summer afternoon, when Thomas was 12 and Margaret was 10 and William was 7, Clara found Caleb standing on the porch, watching the children play in the yard. She came to stand beside him, slipping her hand into his. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. Caleb was quiet for a moment. "I'm thinking about all the years I wasted," he said finally. "All those years I spent alone, convinced I didn't need anyone." He looked at her, his eyes bright with emotion. "And now look at us. 3 children, a home, a life I never thought I'd have. No regrets, only that I didn't find you sooner." Clara smiled and leaned her head on his shoulder. "We found each other when we were supposed to. Not a moment too soon, not a moment too late." They watched their children play until the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. And Caleb thought about how far he had come from that lonely rancher who had ridden into Silver Creek to sell cattle. How much he had changed, how much he had grown, all because of the woman standing beside him. Caleb grew older, his dark hair turning grey at the temples, but his love for Clara never dimmed. She was still the most beautiful woman he had ever seen, with her autumn hair and her green eyes and her quiet strength. He told her so every day, and she never tired of hearing it. On the morning of their 10th anniversary, Caleb woke before dawn. Clara was still sleeping, her face soft and peaceful, her hand resting on his chest. He watched her for a long moment, marveling at the twist of fate that had brought her into his life. 10 years ago, he had been a lonely man, riding into town to sell cattle. He had expected nothing, wanted nothing. And then a woman with flour on her hands had opened a door with blue shutters, and everything had changed. He thought about all the moments that had led them here, the first kiss in the storm, the journey to Boston, the wedding under the mountains, the birth of their children, 1,000 small choices, each one bringing them closer to this moment. "You're staring," Clara murmured, her eyes still closed. Caleb smiled. "Can't help it. You're beautiful." Clara opened her eyes and reached for him. "You're biased, guilty." She kissed him, slow and sweet, the way she had kissed him that night in Silver Creek when everything had begun. 10 years, she said. "Can you believe it?" Caleb shook his head. "Feels like yesterday, and also like forever. The good kind of forever, the best kind." They lay together as the sun rose, wrapped in each other's arms, grateful for every moment they had been given. Outside, the children were stirring, and soon the day would begin with all its demands. But for now, they had this, each other, the life they had built, the love that had changed everything. Clara? Caleb pulled her closer. Thank you for coming to my ranch all those years ago. Clara smiled against his chest. Thank you for asking. They kissed again, and then the children came bursting in, demanding breakfast and attention, and the day began. But Caleb carried that moment with him, as he carried all their moments. A man goes to town to sell cattle. He comes back with a widow who changes his life forever. It sounds like the beginning of a story, but for Caleb and Clara, it was so much more. It was the beginning of everything. In the evening of their anniversary, after the children were in bed and the house was quiet, Caleb and Clara sat on the porch one last time. The stars were out, bright and countless, and somewhere in the valley a coyote sang. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't stopped at my house that day? Clara asked. Caleb considered the question. I try not to. Some things are too painful to imagine. Clara nodded. I think about it sometimes. If the bank had taken the house a week earlier, if you had stayed at the saloon instead, if I had been too proud to accept your offer. But you weren't. No. She turned to look at him. I was desperate and tired, and I had just about given up hope. Then you walked through my door and everything changed. Caleb took her hand. I was desperate too. I just didn't know it. I had convinced myself that loneliness was the same as peace, that if I didn't let anyone in, I couldn't get hurt. But that's no way to live. You showed me that. Clara leaned her head on his shoulder. We saved each other. We did. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the sounds of the night, the wind in the trees, the distant lowing of cattle, the steady rhythm of each other's breathing. Then Clara spoke again. I want to grow old with you, Caleb Hartley. I want to watch our children grow up and have children of their own. I want to sit on this porch 50 years from now, wrinkled and grey, still holding your hand. Caleb brought her hand to his lips. That's my plan exactly. Promise? Promise. He kissed her, and she kissed him back, and the stars wheeled overhead, and the mountains stood sentinel, and the stream sang its endless song. And in the little house in the valley, love endured. Caleb Hartley had gone to town to sell cattle. He had come back with something far more valuable. A partner, a wife, a love that would last a lifetime. He didn't believe in fate or destiny, but he believed in Clara. He believed in the family they had built and the life they shared. He believed in second chances and new beginnings and the power of an open heart. And every day, for the rest of his days, he would be grateful. 20 years had passed since that first day in Silver Creek, when Caleb had knocked on the door of a boarding house and found so much more than a room for the night. 20 years of joy and sorrow, of laughter and tears, of building a life together in the shadow of the mountains. Their children had grown. Thomas was a man now, with a wife of his own and a spread on the eastern side of the valley. He had his father's quiet strength and his mother's kind heart, and Caleb couldn't have been prouder. Margaret had married a lawyer from Denver and moved to the city, though she came home as often as she could. And the youngest, William, had taken over much of the ranch work, freeing Caleb to spend more time with Clara. They had weathered droughts and blizzards, hard winters and lean years. They had buried friends and celebrated births, watched their children make mistakes and learn from them. Through it all, their love had only grown stronger, deepened by time and shared experience. On the morning of their 20th anniversary, Caleb woke to find Clara already up, sitting by the window in her rocking chair. The dawn light caught the silver in her hair, and she had never looked more beautiful to him. "You're up early," he said, his voice rough with sleep. Clara turned to smile at him. Couldn't sleep. Too many memories. Caleb rose and crossed to her, kneeling beside the chair. Good memories. The best. Clara reached out to touch his face, her fingers tracing the lines that time had etched there. Do you remember the first time you kissed me? Caleb smiled. The thunderstorm. You were shaking, and I couldn't tell if it was from cold or fear. It was neither. Clara's eyes sparkled with mischief. It was anticipation. I had been waiting for you to kiss me for weeks. You never said. A lady doesn't say such things. Clara laughed softly. But I thought them. Oh, how I thought them. Caleb took her hand and pressed it to his lips. I should have kissed you sooner. We got there in the end. That's what matters. They sat together in the quiet dawn, watching the light change over the mountains. The house was silent around them, the children grown and gone, but it didn't feel empty. It felt full, full of memories, full of love, full of life. I've been thinking, Clara said after a while, about the day we met. What about it? Clara was quiet for a moment, gathering her thoughts. I was so afraid that day. The bank was going to take my home, I had nowhere to go, and this stranger appeared at my door asking for a room. She shook her head. I almost didn't let you in. Why did you? Clara looked at him, and her eyes were bright with unshed tears. Because something in your face told me you were lost too, and I thought maybe two lost people could find their way together. Caleb pulled her into his arms, holding her close. We did, he murmured into her hair. We found our way. They spent the day together, just the two of them. They walked the property, visiting all the places that held special meaning. The barn where the foal had been born, the porch where they had sat so many nights, watching the stars, the spot by the stream where Caleb had proposed properly with a ring he had ridden all the way to Denver to buy. I remember you were so nervous, Clara said, laughing at the memory. Your hands were shaking so badly you nearly dropped the ring in the water. Caleb grinned. I was terrified you'd say no. How could I say no? Clara squeezed his hand. I had been waiting for you to ask since the day you told me you loved me. That long. That long. Clara's smile softened. I knew, Caleb. I knew from almost the beginning that you were the one. I was just waiting for you to figure it out. Caleb shook his head in wonder. You've always been smarter than me. Clara laughed and kissed his cheek. And don't you forget it. That evening, their children came to celebrate. Thomas and his wife brought their new baby, a girl with Clara's green eyes. Margaret had traveled from Denver with her husband and their two boys. William had organized a feast, complete with fiddle music and dancing. The house rang with laughter and music, the sound of family gathered together. Caleb stood on the edge of the celebration, watching his wife move among their children and grandchildren. She was in her element, surrounded by the family they had built together. William appeared at his elbow, pressing a glass into his hand. Happy anniversary, Pa. Thank you, son. Caleb took a sip of the whiskey. This is quite a party. Ma deserves it. William was quiet for a moment, then said, I hope I find what you two have someday. Caleb looked at his youngest son, seeing so much of Clara in his face. You will. Just don't give up. The best things in life are worth waiting for. Later, after the guests had gone and the house was quiet again, Caleb and Clara climbed the stairs to their bedroom. It was the same room Caleb had slept in alone for so many years before Clara came. Now it was filled with evidence of their life together. Photographs on the dresser, a quilt Clara had made, the rocking chair where she had nursed their babies. Clara sat on the edge of the bed, suddenly looking tired. It's been a good day. The best. Caleb sat beside her and took her hand. Thank you. For what? For 20 years. Caleb's voice was husky with emotion. For 3 children and 2 grandchildren and more happiness than I ever thought I'd have. For saving me from myself. Clara's eyes were wet. You saved me right back. Caleb kissed her, soft and slow, the way he had kissed her 1,000 times before. And just like every time before, it felt new. It felt like the first time. It felt like coming home. "I love you, Clara Hartley," he said against her lips. Clara smiled, the same smile that had captured his heart 20 years ago. "I love you too, Caleb Hartley, today and tomorrow and every day after that." They held each other as the night settled around them, two people who had found each other against all odds and built a life worth living. Outside, the mountains stood guard over the valley, as they had for millennia and would for millennia more. The stream sang its endless song, and the stars wheeled overhead, and the world kept turning. And in the little house at the foot of the mountains, Caleb and Clara Hartley slept in each other's arms, grateful for every moment they had been given. The story of how they met was simple enough. A man went to town to sell cattle. He came back with a widow who changed his life forever, but the story of how they loved, how they built a family and a home and a life together, that story was far more complex. It was a story of courage and vulnerability, of taking chances and opening hearts. It was a story of second chances and new beginnings. It was, in the end, a love story, and like all the best love stories, it had a happy ending. Not an ending, really, a beginning that never ended, because true love, the kind that Caleb and Clara shared, doesn't end. It grows and changes and deepens over time. It weathers storms and survives hardship. It becomes part of who you are, woven so deeply into your soul that you can't imagine life without it. Caleb had gone to Silver Creek to sell 30 head of cattle. He had come back with so much more: a partner, a wife, a family, a life. He had come back with love, and that made all the difference. The end.